Hello everyone and welcome to the Hidden Lives of Writers. My name's Fiona Snyckers and I'm joined by Gail Schimmel.
Hi Fiona, how are you doing?
I am doing much better than last week when I was struggling with a virus. How are you doing, Gail?
I too am virus free, although I have been all along, and well and happy.
So the last time we spoke, I expressed concern that I had been writing in the fog of this virus, and I was wondering when I came to read back that writing whether I'd be able to tell what had been sort of under the influence of antibiotics and what hadn't. And you predicted that I wouldn't be able to tell.
Yes.
And you were quite right. In fact, that month, I went back and edited a month of writing. And on first edit, it was pretty good. I was happy with it. I didn't have to do that much to it. I didn't have to cut as much as I usually have to. But then having done the first edit, I went back and did a second edit to polish it up. And then suddenly it went from, oh, this is surprisingly good to, oh, this is so boring. I can't even stand it. And now I'm wondering, is it just because I know what's coming, or is it really boring? Have you ever been bored by your own work?
So yes, I think it's actually quite an important, I hate to have to say this to you if you're looking for comfort that it's meaningless. I think it's quite an important red flag that if you're doing an edit or a read through and your interest wanes, I think you then have to go, am I actually genuinely tired? I've been doing this for 4 hours and it's okay that my interest is waning, or should I still be interested in this point and I'm not? And I think it can be quite indicative of a pacing problem. Not that all the writing must be thrown out, but something has gone wrong with your pacing and you need to look at it carefully, possibly to read it the next day first thing. And see if when your energy is up, your energy for the story is up.
Yes, and maybe get a second opinion, pair of fresh eyes to look at it and tell you whether the pacing has gone a bit wonky there.
You do that, I don't. So, so I can't relate to that. But yes, if you're a person who uses beta readers, if you're a person who uses those secondary readers, that probably would be a thing to flag. Although you also don't want to tell them a problem might arise in case then they only see the problem because you told them it might be a problem. So
I let the person read it kind of clean and clear, and then I say, did you notice an issue here?
Okay.
But how has your writing week been?
It's been funny. It's been bitsy and bobsy, and it's because I'm rounding off the end of various things. So it's rounding off an edit of a first draft of a new book and rounding off a Katie Gail edit. Actually, I wish that was rounding off, but anyway, dealing with a Katie Gail editor. I'm at the end of projects and it's feeling a bit frustrating, but I also know I want to start the next book with a really clean slate, and I've got a few bits and bobs to get through before I get there, and my day job has been a bit challenging this last week. So, and I have to sometimes allow the day job to come first.
And in your quiet moments, what have you been reading or watching or listening to?
So I have come late to a particular party, and that party is Girl A by Abigail Dean. And I am guessing you probably read it when we were all supposed to be reading it and I was too much of a baby.
Yes, that's the family abuse situation where the court sort of labels one of them Girl A.
Yes.
Yes, I did read that.
So that is exactly, and I'm quite kind to myself in my reading. I don't read books that I know I will find traumatic, and family abuse I will find traumatic. But she has now come out with a new book, and at book club everyone was excited about the new book. And I don't know why, but I decided I was not allowed to read the new book without reading Girl A. So, and I mean, that's such a random rule to impose on myself, but I read Girl A. It's every bit as traumatic as I thought it would be, but it's also every bit as magnificent as everyone promised it would be. And I am pleased that I did it in the end. So those of you who have been putting it off because it sounds too upsetting, you're right, but also you're wrong. It's very, very good. What about you, Fiona? What have you been consuming?
Well, I want to talk about something that I've been watching lately, which is a series called Bad Sisters on Apple. And I believe it was originally a Belgian series, which was then remade by the Irish, completely with an Irish setting and Irish characters. And it fits in very well because a family of 5 sisters, you can very much imagine in Ireland, and the setting becomes a lovely part of it. And it's a kind of dark drama comedy where 4 of the 5 sisters decide that it's time to murder the spouse of their 5th sister.
I mean, fair enough.
No, absolutely. And you so get on board with this project while you're watching it because he is so appallingly awful. And it reminded me of the days when soap operas were fulfilling the role that reality TV fills now. Everybody watched them and got super invested, and your soap opera villain actors would get slapped on the street by somebody who just hated them so much that they'd completely identified them. I promise you, if I saw this man on the street, I think I'd go up and slap him and just say, you were enjoying playing that character far too much. You deserve that slap. He's such an excellent villain and he plays the part so very well. And it's fun and it's dark and it's all the things. I would really, really recommend it. So well done, so well acted, and the Irish setting is just delightful. So that was a good one.
That sounds perfect. I'm wondering now, do you think for actors it's fun playing a villain the way it's fun writing them? Because writing a villain is really fun.
I think if it's not the only thing you're doing in your entire career,
yes,
it can be a lot of fun to get your teeth into being a really juicy villain. So a writer who writes some excellent heroines, or should I say heroes, and villains is our guest today. Our guest today is Samantha Shannon. Samantha is the author of the Bone Season series of books, the 5th of which is being released early next year. She's also the author of the PRIORY of the Orange Tree, which was released in 2019, and a prequel to that series called A Day of Fallen Night, which was released last year. Hello, Samantha, and welcome. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Samantha, we are so excited to have you here that we're bursting with questions, and I have been deep in your world, so I'm really a little bit overexcited, so I'm going to try and calm down. Can you tell us about your writing week so far?
So I'm very bad at writing when I'm traveling. I have been in South Africa for a few days, and before that I was in Budapest in Hungary, and I came straight here from there. So I haven't actually done any writing this week. I'm supposed to be working on the 6th book in the Bone Season series, but I'm just going to have to do more of that when I get home. I find that I write best at home in a familiar environment. And when I'm touring, I'm often doing interviews or I'm doing bookshop events, and there's not usually a lot of time to just sit down and write. And I am the kind of writer who needs to have a little while to sink into the world and get properly immersed in it. I'm not someone who can just chip away with little 5-minute sessions, unfortunately.
So when you are at home and you're writing well and working on your latest project, what does that daily process look like?
It can depend on the day. So I always have to start with a walk. I get up at about 7 in the morning, normally entirely against my will. My brain wakes me up at 6 every day, no matter what I do, which is very frustrating because I work at home and I don't need to get up at 6, but that's just what my brain feels like doing. So I normally take a walk between 7 and 8. I check my emails in the morning because, as I'm sure you both know as writers, there is a lot of admin involved in being an author. So
I don't think we have the admin you have. I'm just putting that on the table.
I mean, you know, it goes in and out. Like sometimes there's periods where there's lots of admin, and at the moment, for example, my 5th book is going to be coming out early next year, and there's a lot of last minute admin before the book goes to print. So we're talking about final proofread and all that sort of thing. So yeah, do my emails, and then hopefully after that I start writing. I am chronically ill, so I have migraines, and I also have endometriosis, and both of those things can cause me various levels of pain. So some days I don't write at all, which I do like to emphasize, because I think a lot of people think that to be a writer, you have to write every day, you have to hit a certain word count every day. Some days I just can't, particularly if I have a migraine, because when the pain is in my head, that's obviously the seat of my thinking. So it's very hard to write around that. But yeah, if I'm having a good pain-free day, I'll normally write probably up to lunchtime. So that's my first little session. And that will be kind of less committed writing. That will be sort of slow writing, planning, thinking about what I'm going to write today. I don't have a word count goal. I have a a task goal, I call it. So today I will finish chapter 14, or today I will write half of the battle scene, or I will write this dialogue exchange between my characters. And yeah, hopefully I will hit that goal. I normally write until sort of in the evening, then I go to bed and try to read. If I'm close to a deadline, the day looks entirely different. That is me hammering coffee the entire day. Too much coffee. I once drank 17 coffees in one day when I was on deadline, which horrified my doctor when I told him, because I said...
I'm thinking there might have been a migraine the next day.
Yeah, there was. Yeah, I don't help myself at all. But yeah, I remember having heart palpitations and the doctor asked me if I drank coffee. And I was like, yeah, just normally one a day. And he said, well, what about not normally? I was like, I don't know, I think I've got up to 17. And his face just fell. So yeah, if I'm on deadline, it can be very long working days. I've never met a deadline gracefully. I've always spent, the whole, I'm writing up till 4 a.m, desperately trying to get as much work as I can done. And I cannot do all-nighters as well as I could when I was a young student anymore. Now I'm in my 30s, I want my sleep, so that's very hard. But yeah, there's not really a single defined pattern to how my day looks, but that's kind of the gist of a little snapshot of my writing life.
And I think the next logical question from that is one of our favorite questions, which is, are you a plotter? Are you a pantser? These books, I cannot imagine that it doesn't take great feats of plotting that are beyond my and most people's ordinary brains. But I then have heard you say on another podcast that you're not that much of a plotter. So where do you lie?
It's a bit of a mix.
Okay.
So to write the Bone Season series, which is a 7-book, 7 installments, I have had to do a lot of planning for that because I've had to plant seeds in book 1 and book 2 that aren't going to blossom until the later books. So that does require a lot of careful planning to make sure that all the twists are hitting right. And I need to think about where each thing is going to come to fruition. So that does take a degree of planning. In a different way, so did the Priory of the Orange Tree, because that's a standalone, and so is the prequel. And that's a different kind of plotting challenge because I can't have any overspill into another book. It has to be one single story, no cliffhanger. It's all neatly concluded. So that also required a degree of plotting. I think probably in the other podcasts, the reason I said that was because I think some degree of flexibility is important, because if you have too rigid an idea of what your plot is, I feel like sometimes you can force characters into situations or reactions that might not make sense at that point in the narrative. So I do like to leave a little bit of room for maneuver, a bit of room to change my mind, especially with the Bone Season having been written across a decade so far. I have changed my mind about some things. So yeah, it's a good mix of planning, but also just allowing yourself to be malleable and to sometimes let the character guide you.
So you've had an opportunity that few writers get, which is a chance to revisit books that you wrote earlier in your life and rework them and reissue them. And that is what you're promoting at the moment, which is a kind of reissue with new artwork and some new added material of the Bone Season series. What was that like? What has been added? What can readers look forward to?
Yes, these are the author's preferred texts of the Bone Season that we're talking about. I wrote the Bone Season, the first book in this series, when I was 19. I was still at university at the time, and I sold the first 3 books to my UK publisher Bloomsbury when I was 20, and that was in my second year of university. And a lot of factors came together to make that publication journey a little bit difficult. So one of them was the fact that I was young. I was trying to juggle a degree with doing a professional edit of a book for the first time. The second was that there was an intense amount of media interest in me because of how young I was. And this was before anyone had even read the Bone Season. But people were, calling me the next big thing. And they were talking about me being this young author who was destined for amazing things, which was wonderful in some ways. Very few debut authors get that kind of launch. And I do fully understand that it was a great privilege to have that. But I was also a very introverted, anxious person. and having to suddenly do TV interviews and talk to journalists and all of this kind of thing that I just didn't realize was part of being an author. You think of it as being a very private profession, and it is to some degree, but the public side of it can be really intense. The touring and the Q&As and talking to readers. I was terrified.
Podcasts.
Yeah. I actually love podcasts. I always have. I'm much better at it now, I should say. I actually really enjoy it now. But there's a learning curve to it, especially if you're not a naturally extroverted person. I have had to learn through experience over time. Anyway, this all made my debut year and the year leading up to it quite difficult because, I was still trying to do a very intense degree at Oxford, which is a very academically rigorous and demanding environment. So anyway, I published The Bone Season in 2013. Last year was its 10th anniversary. My publisher said to me that they would love to give it a new jacket by Ivan Belikov, who is the illustrator who did the Roots of Chaos books. And those books have wonderful covers. And I think a lot of the reason that the Priory of the Orange Tree was so successful was because it has such a stunning cover. So I was really excited because the Priory of the Orange Tree is the book that I feel most people know me for. But I love The Bone Season so much, and I just really wanted that series to find more readers. So I was very excited about this. And I asked my publisher how they would feel if I edited The Bone Season, which, like you say, is very unusual. I don't think I've ever seen another author do a revision this extreme on a book that's already published. My publisher originally thought I meant light edits, and they said, okay, why don't you take away chapter 1 and edit it like you want and then send it to us? And I used track changes on Microsoft Word. And as you know, if you have used track changes, it turns the bit that you've changed quite an aggressive shade of red. And by the time I gave the first chapter back to Bloomsbury, it was almost entirely red. Every single sentence. Yeah, every single sentence had been changed. It was like an abattoir. So they were obviously a little bit taken aback by this because it had already been professionally edited. And I explained how much it meant to me. And I said, look, I love this series so much, but I was aware that the first book was a bit of a barrier to some people. Because I was so young when I wrote it, I didn't have the same knowledge as I do now of how to convey world building elegantly, for example. The first chapter was very overwhelming, like a lot of info dumping about the world. I felt like I'd dropped the ball on some of the character development. There were some really interesting power dynamics and character relationships in The Bone Season, and there was so much rich ground for doing so much more with that. But I feel like my ambition at the time had outstripped my actual ability as a writer at that age. And I felt like I could do it so much more justice now with 10 years more experience. And I think I was just so passionate about it. I can get very energized when I believe passionately in a project. And fortunately, I had a champion at Bloomsbury called Ian Hudson. And I think he found my enthusiasm quite infectious. So he said, okay, we'll let you do it. Fine. It's very weird, but go for it. So I edited the whole first book in the series. And I think when my team at Bloomsbury read it, they could see how much stronger the narrative was and how much more likely people were to enjoy the series. And it could just be small things like making my main character a bit more funny. There were so many jokes that I didn't put in the first time, and I was always kicking myself. There's quite a lot of potential for humor, even though it's a very dark story. And there was this character arc for Paige, the protagonist, that I wanted to draw out more, which is that she goes to this dark version of Oxford and she's imprisoned there. But her imprisonment and her rebellion against her captors ends up liberating her from her narcissistic and manipulative employer, Jackson. And I felt like that arc had not really been brought out properly in the original version. So it was things like that. It was taking out a few things that I found problematic as an older woman. When I was young, I think I had some slightly strange ideas about what was romantic. And now I've changed my mind. It was just things like that, really. And I'm really proud of the new one. And then because I just love making life difficult for myself, I decided to edit all the others as well. So the edits get lighter as we go through the series and we get closer to the present day. So The Mask Falling, the fourth book in the Bone Season series, was only published in 2021. So I didn't really need to change that one too much at all. So The Bone Season and The Mime Order, the first two, those have the heaviest edits on them. And I would much prefer, as is suggested by Author's Preferred Text, that New readers to the series pick up these versions. They're very identifiable by their lovely floral covers. But I also did write them for people who love the Bone Season in its original form as well. I wanted to capture that feeling I think we wish we could all have of rereading our favourite book for the first time again and experiencing it through a new lens. So there's more dialogue, there's deeper exploration of the world. It was very much written for Bone Season fans as well as new readers.
I'm now quite tempted to read the old one and see the changes.
I know people will. I guess it could be interesting from an academic perspective if you're interested in how authors edit their own work.
Yeah, I think as a writer it would be quite interesting to see, because there is that thing that when you look back in an old book and you actually want to die. I want to talk more about world building, and I know it's a hard question to explain to us how one goes about building these really complex worlds. I mean, the Priory of the Orange Tree starts with a map, and I still, because I don't have a functioning memory, I don't know how you did it. I don't know how you managed to keep that whole world together and who's the leader of what country and what their histories are. How do you go about doing that?
The answer will horrify you. It's mostly just in my head. I have an extraordinary memory specifically for my own work. Unfortunately, that means that I don't have a good memory for anything else. I feel like the bandwidth in my brain has been taken up by all these huge worlds I've created. So I can mostly tell you things about my own world, but ask me to remember something that happened last week and I probably won't. So I hope that's slightly reassuring. The map itself was quite funny because I'm absolutely terrible at drawing, and they asked me if I could, explain what this world looks like so that a competent illustrator could do something with it. And I sent the most embarrassing blob, which was just split into 4. And I was like, right, that's Mentenden, that's the Erseer, that's Lacey. Unfortunately, they managed to create something really beautiful out of my very childish scribble I sent them. So it starts off with a concept usually. So the concept behind the Priory of the Orange Tree was the legend of St. George and the Dragon. And I was raised in the Church of England. St. George is the patron saint of England. So he was always quite an important figure in my childhood. But I remember thinking when I was young that he was quite villainous because I loved dragons. And it really upset me that St. George would slay a dragon. I didn't really see him as this great person because I was thinking, why would you kill a dragon? They're amazing. So when I had a gap in the Bone Season series, I decided to basically explore this legend in more depth. I wanted to see where it had come from. There was a person who is believed to have been St. George, who probably did exist, but there was no dragon associated with his original legend.
Strangely enough.
Yeah. He's thought to have been martyred for Christianity by one of the Roman emperors. But yeah, suddenly he had this dragon in the story. So I wanted to trace exactly where that had come into his legend. And I ended up finding some really interesting versions of the story. So one of them was that St. George, he goes to a place called Lycia, and they follow a polytheistic religion in Lycia. I think it's meant to be perhaps based on the Greek religion. And he says, I will kill the dragon that is plaguing your town, but only if you convert to Christianity. And I found that so interesting because, again, he's presented as a very heroic figure in the stories I heard. I found it strange that he had a condition for his heroism and that he was going to force those people to convert or just leave them to die. And it only got worse. The more I looked into this legend, the more of a problematic figure St. George became. Some versions of him are extremely racist and sexist and xenophobic, very Islamophobic as well. And I really wanted to challenge that version of St. George. I was getting more and more angry. So I decided to take some aspects from this legend, specifically about an orange tree. There's a version of the story called The Famous History of the Seven Champions of Christendom by Richard Johnson, which was written during the Elizabethan era. Apparently quite an Elizabethan bestseller, but nobody remembers him now. I think Shakespeare took over that role. And in this version of the story, which is where George is at his most evil, in my opinion, he fights the dragon underneath an enchanted orange tree. And I wanted to ask, why would an orange tree protect a man from a dragon? So I decided it was going to have roots that went deep into the earth and were drawing on the fire in the middle of the earth, which could repel the dragon's fire. And that's where it started. So I basically built outward from that concept. I decided that I was going to give the orange tree to a group of female dragon slayers, and that the key concept was going to be that St. George was not the one who killed the dragon. It was actually the princess in the story, and that he took the credit from her. So then I had to create these two separate religions, one of which was based on the truth about Cleolind, the damsel, killing the dragon, and the other one that was the religion based on a lie, which was that the St. George figure killed the dragon. It just got bigger and bigger from there. I decided I wanted to bring in some real world history and politics. I'm really interested in the history of the 16th and 17th centuries. Lots of really fascinating situations going on in the world at that time. Another thing I wanted to do was bring in more dragon legends from around the world. I've always been very interested in the fact that dragons can either be associated with fire and with destruction and evil, but in some cultures they're also associated with water. They're more benevolent, sometimes considered lucky, and I wanted to reflect that in my world building. So I had to think of a reason why there would be two different kinds of dragon, the water and the fire dragons. And that was how I created the magic system, where there was the fire magic from the core of the world that comes up through the orange tree. And there's also star magic that comes from comets, which created the water dragons. So yeah, I just end up thinking very deeply about these things. And the more questions I ask myself about the world, the more and more it grows. And that's how they end up these massive, sprawling kind of creations.
So let's throw it all the way back to teenage Samantha. I've read that you wrote a full-length novel at the age of 15, but it has not seen the light of day. And then you wrote the first in the Bone season at 19. So at the time, I remember when I was a teenager, I was writing the things that I loved to read. Was that you? Was this genre something that you loved and wanted to write about the thing that you loved? Was that the case then? Is it still the case now? Because you've seemed to have pivoted between urban fantasy and more kind of epic fantasy. Have your own reading interests changed?
That's an interesting question. I feel like I'm quite a wide-ranging reader. So I do primarily read fantasy. I used to love sci-fi when I was a kid. I loved Isaac Asimov, for example. Anything to do with robots, I just devoured at that time. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that was reflected in my first novel, because the unpublished book, Aurora, was more of a sci-fi. It was about 9 mysteriously attractive aliens who landed on Earth and had to be reunited. So it was more distinctly sci-fi than my later work became. Then I wrote urban fantasy and dystopia, which I suppose, again, was somewhat reflective of what I was reading, or certainly what everyone was reading at the time. It was the era of the Hunger Games and Divergent, and the Bone season did very much slot into that category. Although it is a multi-genre book, so it's dystopian and urban fantasy, but also has the scope of an epic fantasy, or that was what I was trying to achieve anyway. So I guess it does reflect my reading to some extent, although I do sometimes go completely out of my comfort zone with reading. I also read contemporary fiction if it sounds interesting. I'll read historical fiction. I try not to be too much of a, religiously stuck to one genre kind of reader.
You've touched on with that something I'm very interested in. Neither of us write fantasy, so this is, I think, actually why I'm so bursting with questions, because it seems like such a magical thing to do. I've noticed fantasy writers accept certain things as given. There are tropes that nobody challenges, and then there are tropes that are challenged completely. How do you decide how to do that? Like, how do you decide? I'm trying to think of an example now with the dragons. Like, some of them in every dragon world, I don't know how to pronounce that word. That is a thing that a dragon made. That word beginning with a W.
Oh,
W-Y,
a wyvern.
Yeah. In every dragon book I've read, which is not huge, but a few, the wyvern dies if the maker is killed.
Oh, really? Interesting.
And how do you decide which tropes to buy into and which tropes not to?
Yeah, so I did intentionally make PRIORY quite a tropey story, but I wanted to switch up exactly how I dealt with the tropes. So it's intentionally designed to be a very epic fantasy quest of the classic variety, where they have to collect magical objects in order to destroy the big bad guy, who is called the Nameless One. And that was intentional, but the people who are the heroes of that quest are supposed to be different from the norm. So usually you would see someone like, I don't know, Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings being that hero. But for me, in order to challenge the legend of St. George, it had to be a woman who kind of was the hero who slays the dragon at the end. So that was Ede, who's arguably my protagonist in the Priory of the Orange Tree. I wanted it to be very much focused on people who were not the St. George I encountered in those stories. So all of the people really who St. George wouldn't have liked in those stories. So women and people of colour and people from lots of different backgrounds who come together to defeat the dragon. That was very important to me because there was no point just doing a straight retelling of St. George and the Dragon. I didn't like that version of St. George. So I wanted to write a book that his creator, Richard Johnson, would not have liked. I sometimes joke I have this like beef with a 400-year-old dead man who does not care. I'm very angry at Richard Johnson. Nobody knows who he is. So yeah, that was the important thing. It was supposed to be Ede, for example. She has some of those classic hero moments that you see in medieval romances, for example. For example, when Sir Gawain in The Green Knight, he is tempted by a beautiful woman. And that exactly happens to Ede when Caliber tempts her in the Bower. And that kind of thing would normally happen to a male hero who's being, lured into the trap of the seductress. But I thought I would have that exact same thing happen, but the main character is a woman instead. Similarly, Ede is the bodyguard, the protector of the queen. And again, she gets to be with the queen at the end. So it was just taking all of those classic tropes and giving them to a different person, essentially.
I've noticed that dragons are having a moment at the moment with Fourth Wing and books like that. And that romantasy has become a huge best-selling genre. And also that fantasy books are becoming spicier and more erotic. Mm-hmm. So when you write in a genre and you observe trends doing well, are you as an author tempted to modify what you're doing to try to ride that wave? Or does that not interest you at all, not tempt you at all?
I mean, I think it's tempting for anyone to jump on a trend. I think it is important to remember that by the time a trend hits shelves, it's very difficult to write a book to match, because by the time your book is published, which, as you know, as writers, the time we write our books is different from the time the book gets published. It can often take at least a year. That trend's probably going to have passed by then. So writing to trend is a really risky thing to do. It can sometimes pay off, but I was just lucky with The Priory of the Orange Tree that it was already a dragon book that was published in 2019 when dragons were not trending. And now I'm just lucky that trend happens to coincide with the fact that I have two books with a dragon on the front, which is lovely, but it's pure luck. I didn't write either of those books specifically to that trend. I don't think dragons were even considered that cool back in 2019. I mean, I guess everyone thinks dragons are cool, but there weren't tons of books about them as far as I recall, apart from the old classics like Eragon, for example. So yeah, the romantasy thing, I think that there is a lot of pressure on authors to make their work more spicy, more romantic, and I can certainly see some of my colleagues doing that, and I do sympathise with it, especially when you see people on TikTok, for example, who say, oh, I won't read a book if it's not, 3 peppers spicy. And I again, you can be tempted by that. For me personally, I think that the kind of books I write are the kind of books my readers know I write. And I think they seek my books out for what they already are, not for something I'm trying to make them. That I don't want to write in order to lure other readers in. I think there's plenty of readers who don't want to read spicy fiction and who do prefer fantasy that isn't focused on romance, and all of my books do have romance in them. I describe them as fantasy with romance rather than romantasy, but the line is quite blurry, I think. The Bone Season series particularly is very romantic, and the romance is arguably the core of the entire story. But yeah, I don't think I'm going to markedly change my work just to rise to meet a trend, as tempting as it is.
I'm very pleased to hear it, because I have to say I found it quite a relief to not suddenly find yourself thrown from a fantasy world into an erotic novel. And you're in different moods when you want a fantasy world versus an erotic novel. And I will not mention it, a popular book, I actually paged through pages and pages and pages of explicit sex. And I've got nothing against explicit sex, but not in the middle of my story.
Yeah, and like you want to still leave options for people who don't like
Yes.
the trends of the moment. And I think it can feel quite alienating to some readers if suddenly the entire genre changes to reflect a trend. It's important to have variety. And fantasy is such a versatile genre. You know, it can be romantic, it can be entirely unromantic, it can be very close to reality, the way the Bone season is. It can be very far away from reality, pure escapism. And it is a great genre like that, and it's why I like it so much. And I worry when I hear like friends and colleagues saying that they're struggling to sell books that aren't romantasy at the moment. And I have heard this, that agents are becoming more pro-romantasy. Because again, it's great. I don't have a problem with the fact that romantasy is so popular. I think there's definitely positive things about that. But I don't want people to feel pressured into writing spice if they're not comfortable with it, for example. And many readers, like you say, don't necessarily want that in the books they're reading. So there has to be options available for everyone.
So when you are doing your world building in this fantastical world, I guess you could choose to have your fantastical world utterly removed from the real world. But I notice that what you do and other authors also choose to do is to tether it into something that's recognizable from the real world. So, for example, part of your setting might have Dutch influences, which was so interesting to me. And to
we were
read
a bit obsessed with the Dutch influence.
the Bone season and see a character called Pieter,
Yes.
you know, which is so familiar to us in South Africa. Where did that interest come from? And do you deliberately choose to sort of tether your world into what might be recognizable in the real world?
Yeah, so I deal with this slightly differently in my two series. The Bone season is set in a version of our world. There was a point in 1859 at which the timeline diverges from ours, but it is very recognizable. So, you know, pages in Oxford, if you went to Oxford, you'll recognize all of those landmarks. Similarly, the London in the book, most of the places you can actually visit. I sometimes combine them with places that were in Victorian London that are no longer there. So there's a slum called the Devil's Acre, for example, which was cleared a very long time ago, but is still in the Bone season series. So I like to combine history with the real world. But mostly when, you know, readers can go to London and they can do a Bone season tour and visit the sites, which is something I love. I love that readers can place themselves in the Bone season. And it's really fun going to different countries and people will ask me, oh, what's my country like in the Bone season series? And I can tell them because I know. And it's lovely to have lots of characters from different places around the world coming together. I really wanted to make this quite a European and also global answer to a lot of American dystopias, because a lot of them are very American. And they're mostly confined to America, like the Hunger Games and Divergent are. I really wanted to write a very pan-European dystopia. So there are characters like in the main cast who are from Bulgaria, Serbia, like lots of different places. And that was important to me. It was a kind of diversity that I really enjoy writing, and having all of these characters from different backgrounds, again, coming together to fight the bad guys. So yeah, there's that way of approaching it, which I love. Getting to explore London, which is my home city, and also explore cities I love like Paris and Rome and Venice. In the Priory of the Orange Tree, the approach is slightly different. So it's a secondary world, but like you say, each of the countries has what I call a touchstone, which is what I use as influence for things like the kind of food they're eating, the naming system, sometimes the fashion. Each country is not the same as it is in the real world, because this is an entirely different setting. This world has a lot of factors that don't exist in our world, like it has a volcano that spews out dragons every so often. So, you know, that world is going to be quite different from the real version of, I don't know, Spain, for example. So Iskalin is based on Spain. There's a whole bunch of things that make Iskalin very distinct from Spain, but Spain is my reference for Iskalin. Okay. And that extends to, I'm glad you noticed the Dutch influence in the naming. So each country, I use a language to create the names, or sometimes more than one. That comes from my interest in Old English that I did during my degree. I wanted to have the names influenced by older forms of existing languages. So in Innis, for example, the names are inspired by things like Old English and Proto-Celtic. In Iskalin, there's Gothic influence as well as Spanish. In the Ursir, it's based on Iranian, like Proto-Iranian.
Yes.
And yes, in Mentingen, it's quite a heavy Dutch influence. So some of the names are from medieval Dutch, for example. And yeah, that's kind of how I do it. It allows me a degree of freedom to still use my imagination and to make these countries different from their real world counterparts. But I also like using that real world mirror to reflect certain historical situations. So, for example, Mentingen and Saiki have a relationship that's loosely based on the relationship between the Dutch and the Japanese during that time. So there was, the Dutch were confined to this little island called Dejima at the edge of Nagasaki. And that's similarly, there's an island called Orissima in the Priory of the Orange Tree, and the Mentish traders are confined there at the edge of Saiki.
You need to do an annotated version of these books. I once read an annotated Alice that just added layers and layers and layers to it, because there's a lot of maths in Alice in Wonderland, which you don't read on the thing. You need an annotated version. I mean, it will be one hell of a book. You'd be able to kill a person
yes.
with it.
I quite like to write like a sort of companion encyclopedia to Priory one day to talk more about some of my influences behind it. But yeah, that also extends to the Queendom of Innis. That's quite strongly based on the Elizabethan court. So the ladies in waiting all have titles that reflect Elizabethan titles. Sabran herself is loosely modelled on Queen Elizabeth I. So yeah, it just provides me with a framework. But again, the countries, there's a note at the beginning that says the countries are not supposed to be direct reflections of any real world country at any point in history, which I do ask that people remember. I think most people can tell what the approximate influences were for each one, but it just allows me to kind of reflect on real world situations without having to be precisely faithful to them.
You did an interesting thing on your Instagram recently. When you were in Budapest, you put up a post describing how years ago your Hungarian translation, you got an email saying that it had become commercially unviable.
Yeah, that's a nice way of saying it, yes.
and that was so interesting to me, because you didn't need to do that. You could have just focused on the fact that you're in Hungary and the translation's doing wonderfully and it was all great. But you chose to open yourself up in that vulnerable moment, which got me thinking, because one can look at your writing career and imagine that it has just been one triumph after another. But you opened the window there and showed us that there have been difficult times. Can you expand on those difficult times and how you got through them for maybe writers who are having a difficult time now?
Of course, I think it can be difficult with social media because people tend to show their, like you say, their successes. They're showing the best version of themselves. And that can make you feel, if you're going through a rough patch, that you're the only one who isn't succeeding and everyone else is living this incredibly glamorous life. And I sometimes do feel like that with some of my fellow authors. It's difficult to see. It's wonderful, obviously, to celebrate their successes. But if you're going through a less exciting period, you can feel a bit left behind. So I've always tried to have an honest relationship with my readers on social media. I'm very blunt about my mental health, for example. I talk about my chronic illnesses and how that's made writing a challenge in some places, how, it makes me feel self-conscious that I'm a bit slower than some of my colleagues because I'm constantly working against some degree of pain. So I have never published a book in 2 consecutive years in a row, for example. I normally publish every 2 years. And I know that it makes it difficult for readers because they have to wait longer, but I prefer to be honest about that. I wanted to be honest about the Hungarian translation because, the exact wording that was used in the email I received in 2015 was that the translation had ended in total business failure.
Ouch.
They were very, very blunt about that. There were no words minced there. And so that was really difficult. I still remember this hot sting of embarrassment I felt because, someone had worked to translate that as well. And I actually met my original translator for the Bone season when I was in Budapest. And I felt so bad for him because he'd worked really hard on it. And then he must have been sent the same total business failure email. So I felt like I'd let him down. He was probably thinking that he'd let somebody down. But it was unfortunately not every book succeeds everywhere. So with translations, it can be incredibly hit and miss. Like my books have hit in some places I would never have expected. The Bone Season has a huge fan base in Poland, for example. And I just didn't, I couldn't have predicted that. So I went to Poland and there were so many people who loved the Bone Season, which was wonderful. And then some places you sell the translation and it could be brilliant translation and it just doesn't hit. And that could be for all kinds of reasons. It could be that it wasn't marketed very well. The Hungarian original version of the Mime Order had quite I'm going to say an unusual choice of cover. It had a cat on it.
Google this.
It had a cat on it. It was quite random, I felt. But I trusted that it was the right decision. Again, I don't know the market, so it's I have to put a huge amount of faith in local publishers who know what they're doing. I don't know the exact reasons that those two translations failed. I'm not saying that necessarily the publisher is at fault, but it was very disappointing at the time. And that's happened in other countries. I think the Bone Season was published in something like 26 languages. And a lot of those publishers did not pick up the second book. So I assume it was not a huge commercial success. But that is just something you have to take in your stride as an author. And a lot of the time I have had a second chance, mostly because of the Priory of the Orange Tree. PRIORY, it hasn't had as many initial translations as the Bone Season because the size makes it challenging, because obviously it's a much more costly translation. And there are places where they've said they would love to publish it in their language, but they just can't afford to do it, often because readers will lean towards reading the English translation. So it's never been translated in the Netherlands, because a lot of people in the Netherlands read very, very well in English, and they'd rather read the original version. That same challenge, I think, is coming up in Germany and Scandinavia. Again, very high levels of English among the population, so they're not necessarily going for translations. But yeah, I feel very grateful that I've been given a second chance in a lot of places, mostly because they've picked up Priory and then they've wanted to pick up my backlist, which is what happened in Hungary with this new publisher. The rights lapse after a certain amount of time, so I can sell them to someone else.
I cannot believe that I have beaten Fiona to this question, because I'm about to ask a very Fiona-esque question, which is, and you've touched on it a bit, is the feminism. Particularly in both of them. In both series, it's a woman leading the action, and in both series, it's a matriarchal society, actually. But in the Priory of the Orange Tree, particularly, so, you like you said, you took St. George and turned it on its head, made a woman the hero, but you do it at every level. Like every time I thought, okay, I've got it, get rid of your innate sexism that you didn't even think you had. Everyone's a woman that you think. And then there's particularly a scene on the pirate ship when the scrubber falls off the edge of the boat and suddenly you realize, and your pronoun is she.
Yes.
And like, it had not crossed my mind that was a woman.
Yeah.
Even though I had told myself you were going to do that kind of thing to me. How conscious was that?
Oh, very conscious. And I actually distinctly remember a conversation about this with my editor in the Mime Order, where there is a scene where Paige, the main character, she fights one of they're called vigiles, they're dystopian police officers.
I haven't read this one yet.
Oh, sorry. No, it's not a big spoiler, don't worry. Okay. But she fights a vigile. And again, the vigile is a woman. And my editor actually stopped and said, wow, like, I know I shouldn't be commenting on this, but it's all of those kind of background characters in novels often, like, regardless of who they are, they could be the dystopian police, they could be someone like a bus driver, for example. We normally default to thinking they're men. And it's interesting, no matter how much of a feminist you think you are, you do this. And I think it's because we have been taught historically that a man is the default type of human being. It's even in the words we use to describe each other. So when I was at Oxford, I learned that the word man genuinely was gender neutral at one point. Women were described as weefman and men were described as wereman. And eventually, at some point, the were part was dropped. The only place we see it now is in the word werewolf, meaning man-wolf. But they basically just dropped that qualifier. So the word for a human being became the word also for a male human being specifically, meaning that we are othered by the word woman, which I've always found fascinating. And I think that does extend to this sense that everyone is a man unless specified otherwise. So in my books, I do try to be conscious of that. In the Priory of the Orange Tree, I have women as knights, for example, and no one comments on it. I do deal with gender in slightly different ways between the two books. So in the Bone Season, Paige does not encounter any form of sexism, really, because the Republic of Sion was constructed by a female ref, which is sort of a goddess, essentially. And I couldn't see any reason why she would create a sexist society. It didn't make sense. So I imagine that she arrived and was greeted by some very misogynistic Victorian men and thought to herself, I am having none of that. And there's something very empowering in having a fantasy novel that doesn't have sexism in it. And it's interesting because there is this relationship between fantasy and sexism that has gone on for such a long time. And I think it's because fantasy has this time-honoured relationship with history. A lot of fantasy novels are based on history in some way. But I realised this was becoming a problem when there was a scene in Game of Thrones where a certain character was sexually assaulted. And a lot of people were very angry about this. I think because it hasn't happened in the book or something like that. It was a very beloved character, and the way that the scene was shot was very focused on a man. And I remember people saying, but it's historically accurate. It happened to women back then. And in my head, I was thinking, well, it also still happens now. It's not just back then. But also, it was the fact that I was thinking back when there were dragons. And I find that some fans of the fantasy genre, they basically use this idea of historical accuracy to keep the genre focused on white, straight men. And they think that anything, if you have people of colour in a fantasy novel, if you have women, if you have gay people, then you must be being woke, and it's not historically accurate. And again, it's based on a completely false notion of history. Even if you're talking about medieval Europe, which I think some people thought was entirely white, that's not true. There were lots of different people from different backgrounds and different races in Europe at that time. There was a lot of maritime trade, for example. And then, there were also queer people in history. Like, people have always existed. Women have always held a degree of power. Yes, of course, they lived in misogynistic societies, but to suggest that women had no influence in history is quite ridiculous. And that's always really frustrated me. So I've spoken to so many young female authors who have said, I made my world sexist, and then I read something like The Priory of the Orange Tree or another fantasy book by a woman, and I realised I didn't have to do that. I had just defaulted to it automatically. And interestingly, in the original version of The Bone Season, I had done that a couple of times. Okay. There were moments where Paige describes other women using misogynistic language. There was a sort of an odd scene where she was sexually assaulted, but it's done quite subtly. You might miss it if you kind of skipped over a sentence, but she's touched in an inappropriate way. And again, that didn't need to be there. And I think very carefully before I consider any instance of that in my books. But I was looking at it and I thought, why is that there? And I thought, I think it's because I thought that had to happen in fantasy novels, and there is no obligation. It's of course, there should always be space to talk about important issues in fantasy novels, but when sexual assault or sexism is an expectation of the genre, that's deeply frustrating, and I think very alienating to female readers. I don't want to be braced for that every time I read a fantasy novel, especially when fantasy is the place where anything can happen. Like, only our imagination is the limit, and we're always defaulting back to these sexist worlds. So in The Bone Season, I have it so Paige doesn't have to encounter any sexism. The men of Sion are genuinely not sexist, and the refs are not sexist. They don't come from a society with gender roles at all. Priory of the Orange Tree, I wanted to not have what I might call everyday sexism. So if there's a female character who's a knight, nobody comments on it. Possibly just because I found that a bit tedious. Again, I think there are places for stories like that. It's great to see women like, I don't know, Daenerys Targaryen overpowering sexism and, proving herself in a male-dominated world. But I didn't really want to do that in Priory. I did want to examine what I might call structural forms of sexism. So, for example, the pressure on women in hereditary monarchies and how they're carrying this enormous burden physically. Like, they have to put their bodies through this hardship that they might not want to go through in order to continue the bloodline. So I talk about that through the House of Berethnet, for example. I also just wanted the book to be relentlessly focused on women. There are male perspectives. So we have Loth and Niclay in Priory, and we have Wolf in A Day of Fallen Night. But the story's very unapologetically focused on female characters because I wanted to give a spectrum of female experiences. In A Day of Fallen Night, for example, there are women who don't want to have children, who do want to have children, who are mothers, who become mothers against their will. There's all kinds of reflections on motherhood. I wanted to give space to those kind of issues that touch women particularly closely in my books, because I do feel that even now, I feel that if an all-female version of The Lord of the Rings was made and the whole fellowship was women, the way that they're all men in the book and the film, I think that would be remarked upon. I think it would be considered woke or somehow political. And, you know, in The Lord of the Rings, I didn't think about that when I was a kid, the fact that they were all men. I mean, I wanted there to be more women in the film. I remember thinking that. But I think, again, it's this idea of man as the default experience. So all of the main characters being men is not commented upon particularly. And I do still think that that would not be possible now. I think if an all-female fellowship was created, people would say that the author was trying to be political because being a woman is somehow inherently political. And I just refuse to do that in my books. I'm being relentless about exploring female experiences. And it's not that I'm trying to be political. I just want to centre women.
I mean, I absolutely love that feeling of being called up on my own, the prejudice that I wasn't even aware that I had, that I never would have thought that I fell into, and having your words call me out on it, I thoroughly enjoyed.
So when you take those misogynistic expectations out of the fantasy world, is a queer narrative a good fit for fantasy? You've described The Priory of the Orange Tree, or so I read, as a sapphic book. Did you find that a comfortable and easy fit?
I think so, yeah. I remember when I was writing it, I felt that these two characters, Sabran and Eid, were drawn to each other romantically. And it was inspired by the entirely non-romantic relationship, I should add, between Elizabeth I and her ladies.
As far as you know.
As far as we know. I remember reading a book where it was really at pains to explain that people often shared a bed with someone of the same gender, and it was certainly not inherently romantic. But I thought, what if it was? Sounds romantic to me. So I decided to explore that. I couldn't see any reason for them. I mean, there are challenges, like the fact that Eid obviously can't give Sabran a child because she's a cisgender woman, and so is Sabran. But I didn't want the fact that they were both women to be the specific problem that they were facing. Again, it's frustrating when all fantasy is homophobic and the gay characters, their romance is inherently forbidden because they are gay. And again, there should always be space for that. Fantasy can be a great engine to reflect on real world issues like homophobia. But I just wanted them to be free of that in this book. And the challenge facing those characters is different. I love forbidden romance, and I often will write forbidden romance between either gay or straight characters. But I didn't want it to be forbidden because they were gay. There's other reasons. Although
they do keep it secret at the beginning in a way that maybe a straight couple and Nicolai, and now I cannot remember the other Dutch one.
Yeah.
Also keep their relationship a secret.
Yeah,
and
that's
there
to
is
do with
secrecy.
Class. It's class mostly because of it. So Eid is not the same.
Yes.
She's a commoner, so that she would not be considered of marriageable material for Sabran.
Yes.
And again, Sabran needs to have a child. Jana and Nicolai is, again, the challenge is that Jana is already married. So it's always for other reasons. There are plenty of couples in A Day of Fallen Night, for example, where there are two lords or two barons who are married to each other because there are no other impediments to that relationship. But yeah, that's more me as someone who is queer myself, just wanting queer characters to still be able to experience the thrill of forbidden romance. Like I love that dynamic so much. And yeah, but I didn't want it to be specifically and only because they were gay. Like it's okay to be queer in the world of Priory.
You've talked about the fact that you are in South Africa for to promote these books, but also because you tour a lot. And I know that you've just been at Comic-Con, and it's made me think a lot, because I cannot think of anything I want to do less than go to a Comic-Con, to be honest. And that you have this interesting overlap of worlds. You have a literary, writerly world, kind of the world that I would go to the thing and feel comfortable in. And then this fantasy world, of people who engage with fantasy in all different ways. Can you talk to us a bit about that meeting of worlds?
Yeah, it's another reason that fantasy is such an interesting genre, because I do think that historically it's been seen as this very niche, nerdy pastime. And even though it's always been very popular, but I think it was considered to be more the realm of Comic-Cons, where there is this more distinct focus on genres like sci-fi and fantasy and speculative fiction in general. I think historically fantasy has not been taken seriously from a literary perspective. And you can still see this, I don't know if it's the same in South Africa, but in the UK, you never see fantasy novels being nominated for prizes like the Booker or even the Women's Prize, like anything like that. It always tends to be contemporary or historical fiction. So there is still, I think, a bit of prejudice and resistance against the genre. Like, I've read plenty of novels that I would describe as being fantasy novels that I think should be eligible for the Women's Prize, often because they are about women's experiences in some way, and yet you never see them. It's really frustrating. I think that is changing a bit now. I have done a lot of literary festivals, like I've done Edinburgh Book Festival. There's quite a few festivals in the UK that I've attended. So I think they're slowly opening up to it and understanding that fantasy novels can do, intellectually interesting things. They can be written in a lyrical way. They can show the skill of the writer. I just think that genre fiction in general has just been not treated very well over the years. And it's assumed to be kind of trash that people just read for pure fun, which, by the way, I think is fine if you only read books for fun. But yeah, to suggest that fantasy is just inherently not a genre that's worthy of recognition is really frustrating. So yeah, I do have this kind of interesting double life where, one side of it is seeing cosplays and you're being at Comic-Con, which is great fun. And there's a lot of energy to that side of it. I love the passion of fans and just how open they are about how much they love things. So that's really lovely to see. And I often have, just wonderful interactions at places like Comic-Con because people are just so devoted to the fandoms that they love. But yeah, and then the literary side is also part of my work, and I enjoy both. I think you get to meet people from, who have very different interests and who approach the books with very different experiences. So sometimes at literary festivals, people will want to talk in more depth about the writing process or, exactly how you craft your sentences and your world building. And then at cons, it might be, people want to gush about how much they love a certain character. And I think that's great. And again, it just shows the versatility of fantasy as a genre. I just hope that we continue on the path of giving it more literary recognition, because I do think that it should receive that.
Have you ever been on a panel or in an interview situation? I think this is something Gail and I have both encountered as people who have written in genres, where you realize that the person you're speaking to is talking down to you or sees you as lesser because you're a fantasy writer.
I think I've largely avoided that, possibly because most of the events I've attended in my life, like they've either been focused specifically on my work. So I'm in conversation with someone and often the other person is a fantasy author. Like they tend to pair us together quite a lot, possibly because it's maybe a less accessible genre for people who aren't used to it. So when they get moderators, like I often chair other fantasy authors in London. I don't remember. I think I've been generally quite lucky in my career that I don't think I've been directly spoken down to by anyone. The only time that I remember having a distinctly strange interview experience was in Madrid in 2014. You can tell I remember this because I remember the year. I remember the year. I remember the place. And it was a man interviewing me, I think, for a newspaper in Spain. And he was saying, why did you write such a weak female character? And it was such a strange question. And to this day, I kick myself for not asking him what he meant by that. And I think he was talking about Paige, who for me is one of the strongest female characters I've ever written. And it was just, it was in a very strange time when people were obsessed with the term strong female character. And they basically seemed to think that if a female character showed an emotion, she was weak. I've literally given speeches on this time in my career because I could go into so much detail about it. I will spare you, but it's a subject that's really fascinating to me. So yeah, I think the only time I've been spoken down to more as a woman than I have as a fantasy author. A couple of things have happened. I remember I was nominated for a French award once, but it was specifically in the children's fiction category, and it was for Priory of the Orange Tree, which is not a children's novel. No. I wouldn't even categorize it as a YA novel. No. And again, I love YA fiction. I think it's great. It can be very experimental in ways that sometimes even adult isn't, but it's not a YA novel. And I remember a lot of my French readers were actually very angry about it because they said that women often got miscategorized in that way. And they were told that they were writing children's fiction when they weren't. And even the judges after this backlash, they said something like, well, we think it's YA, we think it's children's fiction, which I did find extremely patronizing, I must say. Yeah, and I think female authors are still affected by that kind of thing. Again, I think it's getting better. The fantasy genre is dominated by women at the moment. Women are at the top of all the bestseller lists in fantasy. But I do think that from my experience, I think some men are still reluctant to take female authors seriously. And I do sometimes think about what my career would have been like if I didn't use my real name and if I used my initial or I used like a more androgynous pseudonym. But I'm so glad I wrote under my own name because I think it's so important for us to normalize women working in every genre.
Because you so easily could have been Sam.
I could have been Sam, yeah.
And you wouldn't have been a liar. It's part of your name. That's very interesting.
Yeah, we did have the discussion. I did talk about it with my publisher, but I'm really glad I didn't in the end.
So, Samantha, what have you been reading or listening to or watching lately that's made an impression on you?
So I haven't actually watched any TV shows or films in a really long time. I think when I do have free time, I tend to read. At the moment, I'm reading a book called The Lotus Empire by Tasha Suri, and it's the last book in a trilogy by Tasha, which is an Indian-inspired fantasy series, and it's so wonderful. I think Tasha's one of our most brilliant living authors, and I'm very excited to be reading the conclusion to the trilogy because I've loved the first two books so much, and it's just as good as I hoped so far. So yeah, that's the main thing I've been reading recently. My memory is quite poor for anything else I've read. But yeah, that's what I'm reading at the moment while I'm traveling.
Well, Samantha, we hope everyone checks out the new versions of your Bone Season series and also catches up with the Priory of the Orange Tree if by any chance they haven't read it. But thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I've loved talking to you.
Gail, it was such a privilege to have Samantha in the studio with us. It was terrific to talk to her.
It was so exciting. I'm not very easily fangirled, but I did get a little bit overwhelmed by that almost. She's big.
That's a big, big name that we managed to get, so I'm very proud of us. And what did you take from it in particular?
I've made so many notes that it's hard to whittle down, but one of the things I was very interested in, just because I'm in it a bit, was what she said about her translations and how the people who read it in translation will then read the next one in English, thereby undoing the need for it to be translated again. Because with Katie Gail, we're seeing this. We've been translated into a few Scandinavian languages, and we're getting a big following from these countries. And now we're starting to see comments on our social media saying, "Oh, I'm just going to read the next one in English," because these countries do speak very good English, and they can read in English and probably do a lot of their reading in English. And so they're not going to wait for the translation. And it was interesting. I think maybe it was comforting that Samantha Shannon has this problem, so I mustn't be upset that Katie Gail might lose translations.
Translation is such an onerous and expensive thing. One of my books was translated into Spanish for the Mexican market, but the time it took was ridiculous because the publishers had to apply for a government grant, which went through all kinds of hoop jumping to be approved. And then a translator had to be selected, which was another months-long process. Then it had to be very carefully translated, and then only did it come out. So onerous and expensive. And I'm wondering, can we imagine a day when AI is just going to do this for people?
I imagine that day is quite close. And I say this as well, having just come from an international conference for my day job, where one of the issues was using AI to translate advertisements.
Right.
And one of the concerns raised, there were not a huge number of concerns. AI is definitely seen as a useful tool. But one of the concerns raised was by Unstereotype, which is an organization that's part of UN Women about getting rid of stereotypes in advertising. And they raised that when you translate, the AI has learned from everything that's out there, from the internet, from everything that's been published. And what's out there is fairly misogynistic.
Yes.
And that subtle stereotypes might creep into your translation without you realizing. And if that's a threat in an advertisement, then I imagine that could be quite a bad threat in a book. I would imagine you'd have to have a human interface.
Yes, I very much would imagine so.
But an interesting, could be one of the interesting ways that the world changes.
Indeed, indeed. Well, when I was listening to Samantha, I was so struck by what she said about people doing a bone season tour of London. How amazing would it be if someone did a tour of Johannesburg based on the Gail Schimmel books?
I think that the Gail Schimmel books would have to become a little bit more outrageous and fantastical and interesting for anyone to want to do that. But it's such a lovely idea. It really is. I think it's maybe a sign of really having reached a particular level of something if anyone is doing a tour based on your books. I mean, imagine, Fiona.
I went off into a fantasy just thinking about that. But let's take questions now. We got two very interesting questions from Bonnie SP in the Western Cape. Oh, do you?
I do. Bonnie and I were in a writing group together, and Bonnie has in fact just been published in a short story collection, which is a new short story collection from Caravan. And as you know, Caravan are great on the short story front. And the book is called In Other Stories. And I'm quite excited to read that generally and specifically to read Bonnie's story. So what does she have to ask us?
Okay, so she says, my one question is the dilemma of writing for the South African market, i.e. colloquial dialogue, smatterings of Afrikaans, etc., but still hoping for international exposure. What would the rules be, if any? That's interesting. Do you have thoughts?
I have thoughts, having had to change books because of this. When I set out to write for an international market, it messes my writing process. And so I think my main thought would be deal with that problem once you've got the international deal, which probably you're not going to get, but if you are lucky enough, then you can deal with that problem. That is not going to be the thing that stands between you and an international deal.
Right. I agree.
Thoughtful reader will know that you can fix those problems. And I would say if you try to write for the international market, you actually might ruin your creativity and your flow. So I don't think of it while you're writing initially. I think
there's actually a huge market at the moment for highly specific books that are set in a particular community. Publishers are looking for that kind of authentic voice. And the way to deal with it, but again, only once that international deal is in place, is a glossary of terms. So leave the text as it is, and at the beginning provide a glossary of terms. Braaivleis means this, sommer means that, or, whatever other vernacular terms you might have used, explain them in the glossary of terms, or, footnotes on the page so that the person can very conveniently just look down and see what the word means. But that can easily be retrofitted. As you say, don't get in your head about that international deal while you are actually writing the story. I mean,
I've completely got myself into trying to not set books in South Africa. And it inevitably just ends up in a mess. And I have to then undo that and allow the book to be in South Africa because that's what I know. And I don't think that's the thing standing between me and a 6-figure international deal.
So Bonnie's second question, she says, is in a similar light. What are your thoughts on writing first-person point of view from a different local culture? For example, me, a white female, writing from a colored female's point of view, not writing from a political perspective, simply a colored woman going about everyday life. This is something we've talked about in our interviews.
It is, and it is a really difficult topic because I don't know what the right answer is. There's part of me that wants to answer the very politically correct, one could say. everyone must have their own voice and you mustn't try and take somebody else's voice. And as a white woman, you do not understand the story of a colored woman. Do not try and put yourself in her shoes because you cannot imagine her shoes. But then also a writer's job is to imagine. And we're always imagining ourselves in other people's shoes. And I have done it recently in my current, I suppose it's current work in progress. There is a side character, but who I've written a black woman in a first person voice, and I questioned my decision to do that, but she really wanted to speak and she really wanted to tell her view of the story. And I've allowed that to happen. Have I made a mistake? I don't know.
I've also done it. I did it at the beginning of my career. And I think it is fine as long as you are aware of all the potential pitfalls, as long as you are very intentional and careful about it. Maybe get someone from that community to have a read. Maybe there's a place for a sensitivity reader there. Just beware, be careful, be sensitive. Do it to the very best of your ability. And yeah, I mean, we can't have novels just populated by characters who look and sound exactly like us.
And I suppose the other thing would be ask yourself why you're making that decision. Are you making that character decision for the right reasons? Because that is the thing that really serves your story best. Or are you maybe making it for the wrong reasons? You know, I think at every level, you've got to interrogate it more than if you're writing from a person who is like you. And that goes for everybody of every race and every gender and every age.
I quite agree. So we hope that everyone checks out Samantha Shannon's reissue of the Bone Season books and also checks out the Priory of the Orange Tree, which is turning into a series of books set in that world. They are fantastic reads, whether you're a fan of the genre or not. And please get in touch. Keep the questions coming. We're loving them. We are on all social media across the board, and we'd love to hear from you.
You've been listening to another production from Solid Gold Podcasts.